The Great Recession started in December of 2007 and lasted until June of 2009. The expansion period before the recession began started 73 months before its peak, or in other words, the expansion period lasted between November of 2001 and ended in December of 2007. The actual recession itself lasted for 18 months, from December of 2007 until June of 2009, according to the National Bureau of Economic Research. The Great Recession is widely regarded as the second worst recession in American history. Only the Great Depression had a worse economic impact than the Great Recession. Now, this recession wasn't uniquely an American recession. It also affected many countries worldwide. Just looking at this map of countries during 2009, every country in brown is in the middle of a recession, and as you can see, a lot of countries were in brown, mostly North American and European countries. The severity of the recession can be seen by looking at the stock market, or more precisely, an index fund. In layman's terms, an index fund is a collection of stocks that are all bundled together. You kind of think of it like one big pie. Since index funds follow multiple companies, they're generally used as a way to gauge the economy and how it's doing. The S&P 500 is one of these index funds, and it consists of some of the 500 largest companies available on the New York Stock Exchange. The S&P 500 is a good measure of the economy's performance, and it usually follows the trends of the economy as a whole because of the diversity in the companies that make it up. During the Great Recession, the S&P 500 dropped by 48% between August of 2008 and March of 2009. Not only did the stock market tank as a result of the recession, but the nation's GDP also suffered as a result of the recession. As a result of the Great Recession, the GDP dropped by 4.3% from peak to trough, or in other words, it dropped from 15.79 trillion to 15.16 trillion. Since the US is the greatest and the best nation on the planet, it also meant that there was a decrease in American spending across the globe, which can help to explain why a lot of European and other North American countries also suffered during the Great Recession. The expansion period preceding the Great Recession began in November of 2001, and it was mainly fueled by the housing market. Demand for homes were increasing due mostly to loose lending practices that banks were using, as well as government incentives for people to buy homes. The government, with the Taxpayer Relief Act of 1997, added a $500,000 capital gains exclusion for married couples on the sale of a home, or $250,000 for a single person. With this tax break, the government effectively made housing the only investment that wasn't subject to capital gains tax, and as Americans, it's our duty to avoid taxes as much as possible. In addition to this, following the crash of the dot-com bubble in 2001, the Fed lowered interest rates to about 1%, a historically low rate for the time, and this decreased the overall interest rate for loans nationwide. These policies caused demand to drastically increase for housing, and as a result, prices for houses rose as well. In order to keep up with the demand for money, banks started extending credit to people that typically would not qualify for loans. These loans were called subprime mortgages, and they typically took the form of an adjustable rate mortgage. With the mortgages, the interest rate on the mortgage would start off low because of the low interest rate set by the Fed. Every few years, however, the interest rate on the mortgage would adjust based on the interest rate that was currently set by the Fed. So while the initial interest rate was low due to the low rate set by the Federal Reserve, the adjusted rate was substantially higher after the Fed raised interest rates from 1% to a little over 5% over the course of about 2 years, between June of 2004 and July of 2006. When the interest rates on the mortgage changed, it left many people unable to pay their new monthly payment, which increased as a result of their interest rate increasing. As a result, the borrowers would default on their mortgage and the bank would foreclose the house and sell it. Previous to the housing market's peak in 2006, banks were able to use this to make a profit on the mortgage even if the borrowers couldn't pay by repossessing the house and selling it again and making a profit. Because banks were able to make money regardless of the borrower's ability to actually pay their mortgage payments, they started to heavily increase the amount of these subprime mortgages that they were making. Since they were seen as safe investments at the time, rated at the AAA rating, which is generally regarded as the safest, banks would take the subprime mortgages and split them into tiny bits and pieces. Then they would take a large number of these pieces, bundle them together, and sell them as mortgage-backed securities. These securities would periodically pay interest to the holder of the security, while the holders didn't have to worry about their investment being risky, since, they were backed by houses. Mortgage-backed securities were given the AAA rating, the safest rating possible. The banks, after selling off the mortgages they made, would then use that money to make even more mortgages and more securities, and the cycle just continued. After housing prices peaked in 2006 and the economy peaked in late 2007, the bubble surrounding the housing market burst. The low interest rate on many adjustable rate mortgages began to be adjusted and raised, and many Americans couldn't afford their monthly mortgage payments. As a result, homes were foreclosed and put back on the market. But this wasn't how it was before. So many new homes flooded the market that supply of homes increased and the price of homes dropped. This supply shock in housing, coupled with the falling demand, is what fueled the financial crisis of 2008. Now, instead of making money by selling foreclosed homes, banks began to lose money. The first major subprime mortgage lender, New Century Financial Corporation, filed for bankruptcy on April 2, 2007. This lender was the first of many to collapse because of subprime mortgages, and they certainly weren't the last. The best way to describe the collapse of the housing market would be the snowball effect. Once the snowball starts rolling down the hill, it gathers more snow with it as well as more momentum. That's essentially what happened after New Century filed for bankruptcy. More and more companies began to face the problem of their subprime mortgages defaulting, which led to more companies to record heavy losses. In December of 2007, when the economy was at its peak, real GDP was at $15.76 trillion, and the unemployment rate showed full employment at 5% for the unemployment rate. The inflation was a little high at 4%, but it was nothing to be worried about. Fast forward 1 year to December of 2008, and real GDP dropped down to $15.36 trillion. The unemployment rate had spiked to 7.3%, and inflation dropped to 0.1%. With multiple quarters of a declining real GDP, a climbing unemployment rate, and a falling inflation rate, it became fairly obvious that the economy had entered a recession. Real GDP would end up dropping all the way down to $15.16 trillion, and that was at its trough in Q2 of 2009. At its worst, the unemployment rate reached a staggering 10% in October of 2009, and in July of 2009, the inflation rate had dipped all the way down to negative 2.1%. After the collapse of New Century Financial, more companies started running out of money. Among these companies was Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. These two government-backed companies both faced heavy losses, and then they were seized by the federal government due to their significant impact on the economy. Many other financial institutions also faced the same problem with heavy losses that they sustained. In order to alleviate the financial crisis, the federal government and the Federal Reserve stepped in. The fiscal policy that Congress enacted was called TARP, or the Troubled Asset Relief Program, and it was put into law on October 3rd of 2008. This program allocated hundreds of billions of dollars of bailouts to various financial institutions that were on the verge of bankruptcy following the bursting of the housing bubble. This allowed for many large institutions to remain in business and allowed for the economy to not completely collapse in on itself. Many of these institutions that were bailed out were deemed too big to fail, especially Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Basically, what this means is that the negative effects of these companies going out of business would be too hard for the economy, and bailing them out would be much better for the economy. Congress also increased the amount of money that the Federal Housing Administration, or FHA, would insure on mortgages, as well as pass tax credits for home buyers. These two measures sought to increase the demand for houses and to stabilize prices in a collapsing housing market. In terms of monetary policy, the Federal Reserve lowered interest rates to almost 0% by 2009. The Federal Reserve also started buying large amounts of U.S. Treasury bonds as well as mortgage-backed securities. The measures taken by the Fed were meant to increase the money supply throughout the economy in an attempt to alleviate the crisis. In addition to this, the Fed also pledged to continue buying government securities from the public until the job market improved, as well as pledging to keep interest rates low until the unemployment rate fell back into normal levels. By 2012, the housing market had successfully been stabilized, and in 2013, the amount of homes going into foreclosure dropped below pre-recession levels. Soon after 2011, inflation levels began to stabilize close to the 2% target rate, and by quarter four of 2010, real GDP had recovered to its pre-recession levels, and it reached $15.81 trillion. Unemployment, on the other hand, took much longer to recover. Despite the fiscal and monetary policy, the economy did not reach full employment again until September of 2015, when it reached an unemployment rate of 5%. As a result of the Great Recession, new laws were put in place in order to stop it from occurring again. Most notably was the Dodd-Frank Act of 2010, which established many new government agencies that oversee various parts of the economy and ensure that they're following regulations. The new regulations imposed with the Dodd-Frank Act were intended to restrict the lending practices that were gradually being loosened leading up to the Great Recession, and most importantly, the act was meant to prevent another financial crisis like this one from occurring again.